what do you need to support sort of an inbound driven go-to-market function? Well, you need somebody that can answer customer questions, that can help overcome challenges as part of the onboarding process, and maybe as part of the value discovery process for the customer as well. But you're not necessarily selling to them, you're merely enabling them. So that's really where the go-to-market function in a business like that gets to play in the early stages. On the CSM side specifically, it's patience. You have to be very patient. You also need to be able to, sort of control a room, control a customer, like lead them towards an outcome that ultimately they're looking to achieve, but they may not necessarily know that they're looking to achieve, right? Things that are really important in my mind to get a close look at how well the team is actually doing. There's really two areas, right? There's that qualitative feedback that you get from customers, not just in NPS surveys, but these days we have Gong recordings, and we have all kinds of like AI tools that can tell you based on email sentiment, if a customer's happy with you, like pull out valuable bits and pieces about the team's performance. I think for CS itself, we're going to turn slowly into being more concierges and consultants that help customers along the journey, but not necessarily doing a lot of the work, for customers in your product, because the products will actually, get to the point where they solve a lot of the problems, proactively. I think there will be, a lot more startups that can build very cheap products with very few people that deliver a lot of business value. So right now you have a lot of companies that are building, say, a product that solves one major problem and it costs $100,000 a year in the B2B space, for instance, right? I think what we're going to see over the next 5 or so years, we're going to see companies start that, build a product that's a platform that solves 5 problems at $10,000 a year, and therefore we'll be able to sort of outpace what the traditional companies have been doing. I don't think we're going to get back to the times where you can have community managers that are purely focused on customer engagement, as an example, right? I think there will be a place for that in really big companies where community, for instance, is a big driver for customer acquisition. But for smaller companies that aren't really strong on the self-serve side, that's probably not going to be a role in the future. Selling won't help, but helping will sell. And I think that is true more than ever today. Because yes, people may say like, oh, I need to accomplish certain goals and certain metrics, but ultimately the CS mindset is like, I want to be helpful to the customer. In a perfect world, all products would be so easy, so highly valuable that nobody needs to ever, interact with a person unless they really want to, right? And so taking that feedback and figuring out how can we effectively put ourselves out of a job over time, those are going to be the teams and the companies that thrive. CS talks to a lot of different customers and can quickly identify trends. So, if 4 or 5 different customers asking for the same thing, maybe in slightly different ways, then that can be very valuable to determine product strategy on a go-forward basis.
Okay, so today we'll talk about the successful customers always start with successful products, the case for PLG. So what are your thoughts about this topic?
Yeah, I think, product-led growth is sort of a term that's been around for a while. For a while, there was also, customer-led growth. They're really both the same in many ways. CLG was a bit of a different term used for a while. There was some marketing hype around it. But ultimately, having a successful product and can deliver value on its own without a lot of human interaction and human interference is ultimately the path to a successful business long term. Of course, there's always times where you have to sort of help the product along and kind of support it in key phases. But ultimately, having a value delivery purely from the product side first is what's going to get you to a scalable long-term business.
Okay, so you're part of Stage 2 Capital. So tell me more about your thesis of investment over there, and how does PLG fit over there?
Yeah, I'm a limited partner at Stage 2, just to kind of clarify that. which means that I get to see some of the companies, that come into the accelerator. As part of the Catalyst Fund, which is what I participate in, we make investments in very early stage companies that are, just getting out of the product market fit phase, have a few early customers, but really haven't gotten to sort of the inflection point of scaling their growth. The thesis there is more like, who are the founders? What is their idea? Is it an idea that could potentially solve a large problem with a potential large market? But really haven't gotten to the point of fully validating that yet. So it's a very early stage fund, and really comes in sort of at the seed stage, if you will.
Okay, and you're picking that company and you're helping them with the GTM part of things. So what essential components do you think should be in place for those companies to succeed? And what are the signs which tell you, okay, that this company is going to go somewhere?
Yeah, I think the signs would be there's customer traction. Customers are coming inbound for the product. There's not a lot of heavy selling that has to happen, and the company isn't outbounding. So if there's inbound demand, and there's sort of an organic growth function as part of the business, that's usually a good sign that that company is solving a problem that is meaningful. And then it's really just a matter of scaling out the go-to-market function once that is that observation is true. So what do you need to support sort of an inbound-driven go-to-market function? Well, you need somebody that can answer customer questions, that can help overcome challenges as part of the onboarding process, and maybe as part of the value discovery process for the customer as well. But you're not necessarily selling to them, you're merely enabling them. So that's really where the go-to-market function in a business like that gets to play in the early stages.
Okay, that's great. So you worked with Kentic and you took the company from $5 million ARR to $25 million at a 90% growth rate. So tell us some of the concrete steps that you took, and what were some of the takeaways for the audience?
Yeah. Kentic was a really interesting business, and I joined it right at an interesting inflection point as well. A couple of things that were true there. They were solving a hard problem that was also valuable to the customer base, and I think this is one of the key tenets of when you can get to a scalable company. You have to be solving a hard problem. Lots of businesses are out there that are solving simple problems like calendar scheduling, for instance, right? And there's like 10 different competitors. That's ultimately not a super hard problem to solve. Kentic was solving something really, really hard. You have massive amounts of data about your networks. You don't really know what to look for, how to make sense of it, what the terminology is. They brought all of that in and did it in a SaaS way to then present that data in very quick screens, views, if you will, and let people ask questions about their network. So that's what worked there is solving a hard problem, having industry expertise. It was a valuable problem to the customer base, and it was the first company that was doing this in a SaaS native way. Everybody prior to Kentic was doing this with appliances on-prem, heavy data center footprints. And then the last part is that they just had an excellent founder pedigree. One of the key founders there had done basically the same thing for Akamai for 10 plus years, spent time in sort of a cloud provider, and was building some of these tools anyway. And so strong pedigree really helped propel that company forward.
Okay, that's awesome. So how do you successfully build a customer success team in such companies?
Yeah. So I think it starts with you have to identify what success for a CS team actually looks like, right? And also what does that mean for the business? And once you define that, then you start looking for the right kind of talent. I'm a big believer in looking for uncommon talent, right? I've had some of the best successes with hiring, CSMs and CSEs that came from different backgrounds, weren't spending, the last 10 years or so in tech necessarily. Some folks from the hospitality industry, for instance, in some cases, musicians and teachers. They can all make excellent, CS people if they have the right set of ambitions, and they have realistic goals for themselves in terms of what they want to accomplish, and then it's really my job to enable that and to get them to success.
Musicians and teachers. Oh, this is very interesting. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, music is basically just, abstracted code. It's sort of like the original code, and the mindset or the mental connections you have to have in order to be good at music are actually very similar to be good at technology and good at programming. So there's something very relatable. Also, if you're a musician, you tend to be scrappy. You tend to be creative, and you tend to try and figure stuff out based on what you're looking to play or what you're looking to learn. And those are all skills that translate well into a startup CS role, because oftentimes there are no playbooks, right? There's nothing written down. You kind of have to make it up as you go along the way, and then document over time. All of those are really transferable skills from a musician standpoint.
And from the teacher standpoint?
From a teacher standpoint, on the CSM side specifically, it's patience. You have to be very patient. You also need to be able to, sort of control a room, control a customer, like lead them towards an outcome that ultimately they're looking to achieve, but they may not necessarily know that they're looking to achieve, right? And so that mindset and just being able to, read the room and then direct people appropriately, actually is very relatable to what a teacher is accomplishing.
Okay, that's awesome. So you talk about delivering high NPS scores. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah. So, gosh, NPS is like it's the thing that gets people all riled up. And so I always look at NPS as sort of a lagging indicator, right? Great NPS tends to start with a product that solves a difficult problem, right, for customers. In an elegant and low friction or lowish friction way. In other words, NPS is primarily influenced by your product, right? And it's one of these things that the whole company should be looking at, but not necessarily deriving towards a certain number, but should use NPS as sort of a mirror to say, like, okay, how are we actually doing, right? Are we inflecting things positively or negatively? On the CS side, in a best case scenario, CS can drive maybe 5-10 points on NPS in sort of one direction or the other. At most, maybe 20. But it's really an observational metric in terms of how you're doing as a business. And you should never manage to it, but instead use it as sort of a mile marker in terms of understanding where you stand.
And you've mentioned that you can move 10-20 points with the CS activities. And so you come in a situation where this NPS isn't great. So what would you do from the CS point of view?
Yeah, I think the first thing you would do is you would understand, like, why is the score what it is today, right? Usually you ask the question, right? Would you recommend this product, yes or no? And like on the scale of 0 to 10. But then there's generally at least one other question that asks, like, why, right? And so you look at that, qualitative feedback that people would give you there to understand, like, are people complaining about the product? Are people not getting help? Is it too difficult to accomplish certain tasks, right? And looking at that qualitative feedback to then determine if it's something that CS can inflect on a short-term basis, right? Should we do more trainings? Are we not talking to customers and they're asking us to talk to them? Are we talking too much to our customers? Like, that can also be true. Like, sometimes people are like, I don't want to be bothered, right? Like, why are you setting up monthly calls with me? And so you look at that, and then you make a determination from that to say, like, okay, here's what we're hearing in terms of that qualitative feedback, and here are some of the changes that we can make to address that. And then that usually drives a 5, 10, maybe up to 20 point change on the NPS side.
Okay, and what matrices you consistently monitor and throughout the journey? So obviously from 5 million to 10 to 25, does that change, or is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, in terms of like how to measure the team. Excuse me. I tend to So obviously there's, things like, GRR and NRR and like, those are sort of the outcomes metrics. And of course you want to keep a really close look at, a close eye on them. And obviously, CS tends to own a bag, right? Or own a number. So you want to make sure that you're accomplishing those goals or like resetting them if they're unrealistic based on the business impacts. That being said, the things that are really important in my mind to get a close look at how well the team is actually doing, there's really two areas, right? There's that qualitative feedback that you get from customers, not just in NPS surveys, but these days we have Gong recordings, and we have all kinds of like AI tools that could tell you based on email sentiment, if a customer's happy with you, like pull out valuable bits and pieces about the team's performance, and you want to look at that, basically on a weekly basis, if not even more real time, right? What are people saying that's positive about your team? Anything that's negative, any constructive criticism, any particular patterns that you can glean from that, and then take corrective action with the team as early as possible. So I would say that part. And then another thing that I kind of look at to just get a read on, is it time to start hiring versus, should we continue to burden people with more work outside of just looking at like ARR load and things like that? Is calendar busyness, right? You look at a CSM's or an engineer's calendar, and if more than 75% of the time is sort of booked, right, of actual customer-facing meetings or other meetings that have a substantial audience, then that becomes time to start considering another headcount, because 75% is right about the time where, and not everybody accounts for all the time that they spend anyway with customers. So, at 75%, it becomes just busy enough that, they may not have time to follow up on everything that they're committing on. And so that is usually an indicator that it's time to add more headcount.
And with this advent of AI and all of the tools that are out there, how do you see the role of CS changing or evolving with time now?
Yes. So I think, yes, AI, obviously it's everywhere. I think the advent of Gen AI is going to bring some really interesting changes, in the world of SaaS and CS specifically. I think for CS itself, we're going to turn slowly into being more concierges and consultants that help customers along the journey, but not necessarily doing a lot of the work for customers in your product, because the products will actually get to the point where they solve a lot of the problems proactively. Some VCs are talking about there will be a $1 billion valuation company with a single person, right? Solo founder builds a $1 billion company. I think that might be a bit of a stretch, but it's also possible that we get there in 10 plus years or so. Could be sooner, but I definitely think there will be a lot more startups that can build very cheap products with very few people that deliver a lot of business value. So right now you have a lot of companies that are building, say, a product that solves one major problem and it costs $100,000 a year in the B2B space, for instance, right? I think what we're going to see over the next 5 or so years, we're going to see companies start that build a product that's a platform that solves 5 problems at $10,000 a year, and therefore we'll be able to sort of outpace what the traditional companies have been doing. I can definitely see that. One example would be somebody will come after Salesforce and they will absolutely try and build a better CRM that does all these other things and does it all natively with AI, and it does it for a fraction of the cost, because there's not going to be a need for as many developers, as many CS people to build a company like that, with Gen AI being a real thing now.
Oh, okay, that's awesome. So you've actually worked at People Data Labs, and that's another success story. So it went from $10 million ARR to $30 million ARR. So what did you do differently than Kentech, and what remained the same?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is like PDL, People Data Labs, was a very different business from both Kentech and the company I'm at now, FOSSA, right? Their whole business model there is they sell data as a service, not software as a service. So the enforcement model, if you will, of the as a service part was purely based on the contractual constraints that we put on customers. Once you make a data purchase, right, you get a record about, say yourself or a company. Those were the two main record types they would sell. You could keep it forever, and you wouldn't have to tell them necessarily. Now, you were obviously obligated to delete the record once you were no longer a customer, but there's really no hard way to enforce that, right? Like other than potentially a lawsuit. And so that was one of the things that it was just kind of very different in terms of the business model. And so from a CS perspective, that meant that we were really less focused on the quote unquote retention piece, because ultimately a customer could decide to depart, and then we couldn't, we would have to just enforce the contract, but it was outside of sort of direct control. It was really more about taking the feedback about the data set, making constant improvements to the data set, and then continuing to build a valuable product, if you will, with the input that CS was gathering from the customers. When I joined there, it was also, at the beginning of 2021, when we saw, a pretty, distorted reality when it came to sort of like what happened during the pandemic, and lots of funding, going to startups that were massively spending on data products. And so we saw quite a bit of hyper growth over the course of that year, doubling. And as a result of that, we needed to massively, build up the team very, very quickly. I think I spent the first 3 or 4 months, hiring almost 10 people during that time, which was a new motion. And inevitably, you ended up with maybe not the world's best talent, right, at every hire. So that was a challenge, and then getting everybody trained and getting everybody up to speed very quickly, which was a very different motion from Kentic and even FOSSA today. We're much more planful. Growth is 20, 30, 40% a year versus 100% plus, and we can do things a lot more planfully, if you will. So that was a bit of a difference. And then lastly, the customer profile that we were dealing with at PDL compared to both Kentic and where I'm at today. PDL would have a lot of startups as the customers, which was both great, because oftentimes they were building their products on top of sort of our product, the data that we would provide. The flip side of that was, startups tend to be either, doing really well and growing, and thus, being able to meet their obligations, or they can, go bankrupt or just evaporate, or just decide that they don't want to pay you, and you don't have a lot of recourse against that. So, we ended up, seeing quite a bit of attrition as a result of, big appetite, but then very little ability to actually pay for the purchases. So that was also a very different motion, if you will, compared to the more traditional SaaS companies that tend to have bigger customers that are well vetted and have credit, and tend to honor their obligations.
Okay, and so what's the difference in the playbook? You mentioned that there's this company which is growing at 100% rate, and then there's a company which is just growing at a 25% year on year. So what changes? What differences are there?
Well, the difference that I observed was that, in 100% growth, you had to staff up very quickly. And we were kind of getting, not surprised, but that growth was happening, in a way that wasn't necessarily planned. So we had to, by necessity, staff up very quickly, build, some sort of training program. When you're bringing on, 10 people or so in the course of a couple months, learning by osmosis doesn't work, right? Like that's normally what you do in a startup. You don't have a formal training program until you get to, a couple hundred people. Every time you bring on a new person, you buddy them up with an existing person, and then they shadow for 2-3 months, and then at the end of that, they tend to be self-sufficient, and they can have their own book of business. That's the normal playbook. In a world where hiring that many people, it's not really possible to set them up with a peer buddy, and so we had to develop some written documentation, some training courses, learning and enablement that actually became a function there. We had hired somebody about midway through 2021 to focus purely on learning and development for the company as a whole, because we were bringing on that many folks and really needed that as a defined function. L&D is not usually a role that gets hired until 2, 3, 400 people at a company, generally a lot later. So that was also a deviation from sort of the quote unquote normal SaaS playbook.
Yeah, so you mentioned that there's a lot of like shadow learning and maybe this on-job kind of learning. What other mechanism that you put in place in terms of grouping and in terms of bringing people up to speed and training them and coaching them for the success?
Yeah, well, it's gotten a lot easier to do that in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years since the advent of Gong and the ability to record calls, and probably even more so in the last year and a half or so when you have these AI summaries where you can have a whole Gong call and it gets distilled down to maybe a half a page worth of notes. And so being able to give people access to effectively a whole like library of like, hey, this is an excellent customer call, and you obviously have to classify them. So in a product like Gong, you can go and say like, okay, this was a good call, this was a bad call, right? And here's the reasons why, and sort of critique it after the fact. But you can build a whole library of like, okay, this is what good looks like, this is what great looks like, this is what not so great looks like, and then give people a way to consume that content on their own versus having to experience it for themselves for the first time, right? And so it's gotten a lot easier to do that because of the advent of some of those tools.
And so given the recession that's maybe around the corner, or how do you call it? But so has the role of CS changed and evolved given this finance climate that is around?
Has the role of CS changed as a result of sort of what we're seeing in the economy, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think that the role of CS is always evolving, right? I think we have definitely seen probably in the last year or so CS to be held to more rigorous standards when it comes to revenue. I've seen a lot of CS organizations in the past, other companies, not the companies that I was part of, that were sort of like tied primarily to customer advocacy, or like NPS was an actual goal of theirs, right? Or number of G2 crowd survey completion, so maybe Gartner Insights or something like that. Those are all like interesting outcomes for CS to accomplish and to achieve. However, those should not be the yardstick that you measure the team on. It really needs to be on gross retention, net retention, and things that you can directly inflect, like adoption of your product. And so I think what we've seen in the last year is like more and more companies saying like, what are we actually getting for the expense here, right? Like are we just driving happy quote unquote survey results? If that's the case, like, do we really need that? And so like the teams that had that as the primary metric have either been completely cut or significantly scaled back. I've always been a big believer that CS needs to live and die by retention and growth numbers. And so those teams that have had hard GRR goals, specifically on a quarter-by-quarter basis, cohort basis, and so forth, those have continued to get funding, right, and are viewed as a profit center, not as a cost center when it comes to taking a look at the whole business. And so on a go-forward basis, I do think we're going to see more of that. I don't think we're going to get back to the times where you can have community managers that are purely focused on customer engagement, as an example, right? I think there will be a place for that in really big companies where community, for instance, is a big driver for customer acquisition. But for smaller companies that aren't really strong on the self-serve side, that's probably not going to be a role in the future. Like for a while, there was professional CS podcasters, right? That would run sort of a company podcast for the business. That is probably also not going to get funding unless it's an additional responsibility somebody takes on voluntarily and does in their quote unquote free time. And so I think we're going to see much more alignment to hard metrics, driving GR, driving NR. And then, over time, as things get better, I think we'll see a slight expansion again in terms of the responsibilities.
And how do you foresee this behavior where most of the matrices are hard numbers right now? So does this lead CS guys to be more aggressive in pursuing those dollars? Is it like aggravating the customers? Is it like helping them? Like, how does the balance change?
Yeah, there's a really famous quote. Well, famous to me. I quote this
Hmm.
person a lot. I don't know if others know this, but J.B. Wood from TSIA many years ago said, selling won't help, but helping will sell. And I think that is true more than ever today. Um, because yes, like people may say like, oh, I need to accomplish certain goals and certain metrics, but ultimately the CS mindset is like, I want to be helpful to the customer, right? I'm looking to provide significantly more value than what they're paying for, and if that is true, if I do the right things, it will be rewarded with renewals and expansions and upsells. And so I do think that that is exactly what we're seeing now. The companies that continue to do well are continuing to invest CS resources in helping those customers achieve value and bring back their feedback on how to make the product better, with the end goal being that customers like long term, the goal always has to be there needs to be no CS, right? In a perfect world, all products would be so easy, so highly valuable that nobody needs to ever interact with a person unless they really want to, right? And so taking that feedback and figuring out how can we effectively put ourselves out of a job over time. Those are going to be the teams and the companies that thrive. And of course, nobody will ever really be out of a job. There will always be new things that you can do, but the goal shouldn't be like take on more manual tasks and manual labor for customers. The goal should always be like, hey, how can we automate ourselves out of having to do all these things so we can ultimately, get to do other interesting things in the business.
Okay, that's awesome. So product success, is this a part ownership with customer success also? So,
Yeah, I think product teams come in all different shapes and sizes,
Mhm.
and all different aspirations. No product manager is going to talk to customers all day long. That is
Mhm.
generally the CSMs and CSE's job, right? They
Mhm.
are on the front lines every single day having these
Mhm.
conversations. And so bringing back the feedback and also the context, right? Oftentimes, customers will ask for, hey, I want X, Y, and Z. And, an okay CS person will say, okay, let me write that down and I'll relay that back to the product team.
Mhm.
A great CS person will ask a bunch of additional questions like, okay, I hear what you're saying. Why? Right? Like, what are you
Mhm.
looking to accomplish with that ask? Is that something that inflects a certain business metric? Is that something that makes your life easier? Right? Is that a cosmetic enhancement that you're looking for? Is this something that is completely breaking your workflow if you don't have it? Right? And
Mhm.
understanding the why behind the ask then
Mhm.
allows CS to provide additional value to inform the product direction and strategy. And also, like the last part of this is like obviously CS talks to a lot of different customers and can quickly identify trends. So if 4 or 5 different customers asking for the same thing, maybe in slightly different ways, then that can be very valuable to determine product strategy on a go forward basis, because they can aggregate that and say like, oh, hey, it's not just one customer asking for this. There's a whole pattern here. And oh, by the way, like I took what I learned here and I asked a bunch of my other customers that didn't bring this up yet if this would be interesting to them, and they said yes, right? As one example. Now all of a sudden you have something that's a lot more powerful to inflect and inform the product strategy.
Okay, so now you have collected all of the info, you've figured out some trends, you've figured out some workflows that are breaking. How do you convince the product team to actually work on this, all of this?
Oh, that yes. It's the you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink.
Mhm.
I think the first piece there is like we have a lot of empathy in terms of what can be accomplished, and I think like CS generally has a high degree of empathy with both customers and teams internally. We generally realize that not every great idea can ultimately be pursued in a reasonable time frame. I think the secret is open communication, right? So we may
Mhm.
say, hey, here's five things that we're hearing from customers consistently. And we should do all 5 of these. But let's work together to figure out like what is the number 1 priority that we could work on, and then how can we get that funded in the product and engineering team. And then once we do that, like what does success look like for that, and how do we know that we get to the next one, right? And so it's really like working through that cycle, and then letting the product team have direct exposure to the customers as well. So again, they don't talk to every customer all day long like CS does, but they certainly should be having key conversations, either in QBRs or in sort of like special roadmap presentations, where the product team can get direct feedback and ultimately, can validate what they're hearing from the CS team. So it's really like a partnership. I would argue that, companies that do really great CS to product relationships internally are the ones that ultimately thrive. And I've seen this work really well here at FOSSA. I've seen it work really, really well back at Kent as well.
Okay, so do you see a difference between customer-led growth and a product-led growth?
Yeah, I think I tried to kind of get to that at the beginning a little bit. Ultimately, they are much of the same thing, slightly different labels. I think PLG was there first, and the intent of PLG in the early days was like, we don't need anybody to talk to customers. We can just let the product like stand on its own. If we build a great product, they will come, right? And I actually think that at its core, that can still be true for very simplistic products, right? If you think of going back to the calendar scheduling app, in an ideal world, like you should never have to talk to somebody. It either works or it doesn't work. It either gives you a good experience or not. And if it doesn't give you a good experience, it's not a lot of money that you're spending on that, right? You can just cancel it. I think the customer-led growth part is really what we're doing with CS, where we're taking higher value products and we're getting the customer's feedback to inform the product strategy, to then get to a point where at scale, you have a tens of thousands of dollars a year product, that can be product-led in the end. And so, one company that has gone through that transition, historically was Looker. Looker, when they started out, was very much a CS, wrap everything around the customer, get them to success and help them, and that was reciprocated with lots of love. After the Google acquisition, over the course of about 2 years, with the mindset that Google has, it's like they basically phased out the CS motion altogether, because they had gotten to a point where they'd taken all the feedbacks and all the learnings and incorporated it into the product, and now only the biggest customers have a dedicated team where they actually get to talk to somebody or have to talk to somebody in order to get value. And so, customer-led growth ultimately leads back to product-led growth if done correctly.
Okay, that's awesome. So just going through stage 2 capital, the first VC firm run and backed by 500 plus go-to-market leaders. So why go-to-market leaders, and why did all of them combine rather than the product and the other traditional VC?
Yeah, I think that go-to-market leaders just have seen a lot of things and have done a lot of things, and can inform sort of like what can be more successful more quickly than maybe venture funds that purely focus on just product, right? I'm not saying that stage 2 is ultimately going to outperform all of the more traditional venture funds. I do think though that bringing together field practitioners, people that have seen this before and have done this before, and it can help provide those insights and those learnings to the startups that ultimately get accepted into stage 2, I think is really valuable, right? Because oftentimes you have first-time founders, they haven't gone through the whole cycle yet. They don't know what pitfalls may lie around the corner. Oftentimes, you sort of have to make some mistakes yourself, but you don't have to make all of the mistakes yourself. And so, by having the expertise of us 500 or so, we can help avoid some of those things. There's some common errors that I think a lot of companies go through, and they can avoid that by having some of the expertise that we have at stage 2.
Oh, okay, that's awesome. So, what future do you foresee for the success of new B2B SaaS startups, and considering this today's market right now?
Yeah, I think I may have touched on this a little bit earlier already.
Yeah.
I think Gen AI is really going to change things. The last 10 or so years, I think we've seen SaaS, quote unquote, over earning a bit, and you can see that that's true by simply looking at the margins, right? Especially of some of the public companies, the gross margins have been really attractive, and that's great. But what's the old saying? Your margin is my opportunity. I think that's what we're starting to see in the last 2 or 3 years when money wasn't free anymore, or certainly now with higher interest rates in the last 2 years or so, and as a result, we're seeing much more scrappy businesses get built again, and I think it's going to be even easier to do that because we do have Gen AI. And I think you're going to get to a point where the marginal cost of using AI tools to build a company is going to zero over time, right? Meaning that you're not paying extra to get those capabilities, but you're getting massive economic lift by being able to build a fully fledged Salesforce, for instance, with maybe 10 developers and maybe $1 million or $2 million in funding, versus historically that would have taken hundreds of millions in funding, big team to get that stood up. And so I think we're going to see a massive number of new products come to market that are being built by very small, very efficient teams that are using lots of generative AI coding and services to deliver that. And so that's going to make things a little bit different, right? It's going to require CS motions to be different. You're not going to see CS teams of the size that we've had historically. I think you're going to maybe see in a company of 10, one person that sort of focuses on both pre-sales and post-sales, enabling customers, get them to value, maybe facilitating some contract work if necessary, but ultimately they're just looking at volume. I think we're still going to see some enterprise scale companies, but I think there's going to be less of them because there's just going to be a plethora or just an explosion, Cambrian explosion of new businesses that are now possible that just historically have never been possible.
Okay, that's awesome. So, in terms of this CS domain, if somebody wants to learn more and get deeper dive into some of the best resources and tools that are out there, where should they go? Which books, which blogs, which personalities they should follow and listen to?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think it's continuously evolving. Up until about a half a year ago or so, I would have said, take a look at Catalyst. The founders of Catalyst, the two brothers, were kind of like some of the marquee folks out there. They're still around. They've since merged with Tatango, which is another CS platform. Lots of good content still out there on that. Success Hacker is another interesting one, sort of an independent third party. They have lots of interesting content on their site, so I do recommend that. I always think it's funny because their logo is a donkey with a plunger, so it's a unicorn donkey. And so that's a good resource. Gainside, being sort of the OG CSP, the CS platform, has an interesting online university, lots of free content, and so that is something else I would recommend to get familiar. And then lastly, just get out there and talk to the CS practitioners. I would argue if somebody reached out to me on LinkedIn right now and asked hey, do you have an hour? I want to ask you some questions. I would be open to it, and I think most of the other CS leaders would do the same.
Okay, that's awesome. So, I truly enjoyed our conversation. I could have continued for more. I think we're coming close to the time. So, is there anything that I've missed that you want to
add? No, I really appreciated the time too. I think maybe the overarching theme here is there's going to be continuous evolution. There's always change happening, and the CS teams that you see today are going to be very different in a year's time or even 5 years time. So it's a continuous journey, and this is a field that is relatively new. It's been around for 15 or so years, and it may be completely different in 5 years from now. So always be learning and always be flexible when it comes to the space.
Okay, so I mean, have a very, very nice day. I mean, I truly enjoyed talking to you. Okay.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye bye.